Picture this. A packed high school auditorium, 1,200 students crammed into seats, administrators on stage delivering the usual back-to-school announcements. The energy is restless, typical teenage indifference mixed with anticipation for the weekend. Then the principal calls a new teacher to the stage for introduction. She's young, black, confident, walking with purpose toward the microphone. What happens next will be recorded on dozens of phones, shared across social media, and talked about for years to come. Because when three popular seniors decided to shout racial slurs during her introduction, they had no idea they were about to face someone who'd spent 15 years mastering one of the world's most disciplined martial arts. This is the story of how one moment of hatred met an unstoppable force of dignity, skill, and justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn. As Dr. Amara Williams pulled her silver Honda Accord into the faculty parking lot of Riverside High School in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. At 29, she was younger than most department heads, with natural hair styled in an elegant twist, warm brown eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her navy blazer was perfectly tailored, her stride confident as she approached the sprawling brick complex that would be her new professional home. Riverside High stood as a monument to suburban prosperity, its manicured lawns and modern facilities serving nearly 3,000 students. From the affluent neighborhoods surrounding Atlanta's northern suburbs, the school boasted state championship banners in multiple sports, a 96% college acceptance rate, and a reputation for academic excellence that attracted families from across the metro area. Yet beneath the polished surface, long time, staff whispered about problems that no standardized test could measure. Amara had been recruited specifically to address those problems. With a doctorate in educational leadership from Howard University, a master's in English literature from Spelman, and 5 years of transformative work in Chicago's most challenging schools, she was Riverside's new assistant principal for student affairs. Her mandate was clear but delicate: address the growing issues of bullying, social media harassment, and what the school board delicately termed cultural insensitivity, without disrupting the academic reputation that kept property values high and donations flowing. What the hiring committee didn't know, what wasn't mentioned in her carefully crafted resume, was that Dr. Amara Williams held a 4th-degree black belt in Taekwondo. She'd started training at age 8 in Detroit, where her grandmother had enrolled her after a particularly brutal encounter with neighborhood bullies who'd targeted her for being too smart, too quiet, and too different. Master Chun, a Korean war veteran who ran a small dojang above a corner store, had seen something special in the serious little girl who absorbed every lesson like a sponge. 15 years of training had shaped more than just her physical capabilities. The discipline had carried her through undergraduate studies at Spelman, where she'd graduated summa cum laude while competing at national Taekwondo championships. It had sustained her through graduate school, where she'd written her doctoral dissertation on conflict resolution in educational settings. Most importantly, it had given her an unshakable center, a calm confidence that no amount of hostility could disturb. Her first week at Riverside had been carefully orchestrated introductions and orientation meetings. Principal Robert Harrison, a nervous man in his 50s who seemed perpetually worried about parent complaints, had walked her through the building with the enthusiasm of someone showing off a prize that might break. The faculty had been politely welcoming, though she sensed the underlying currents of curiosity and skepticism that always surrounded change in established institutions. The students, however, were a different story entirely. Riverside's hallways buzzed with the kind of barely contained energy that came from teenagers who'd grown up with privilege and understood their power within the school's ecosystem. Most were genuinely good kids focused on academics and college preparation, but there were undercurrents that concerned her. Conversations that stopped when she approached. Looks that lingered too long. Comments that walked the line between inappropriate and plausibly innocent. At the center of these undercurrents were three seniors who seemed to glide through the halls with the confidence of young men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. Tyler Brennan was the ringleader, 6 feet of athletic swagger, wrapped in designer clothes, and an easy smile that charmed adults while masking something harder underneath. His father owned a chain of successful car dealerships. His mother sat on the school board, and Tyler himself was being recruited by Division I colleges for lacrosse. Flanking him were his constant companions, Jake Morrison, whose family's real estate empire had developed half the subdivisions in the area, and Marcus Chen, no relation to her old master, whose parents were prominent surgeons at Emory University. Together, they formed what teachers privately called the Untouchables, students whose family connections and future prospects seemed to insulate them from the normal rules that governed everyone else. Amara had encountered their type before. In her Chicago schools, though usually with different demographics and different sources of perceived power. Bullies were bullies, regardless of their zip code or trust fund balance. What made these three particularly dangerous was their sophistication. They'd learned to operate in the gray areas, to push boundaries without crossing lines that would trigger serious intervention. Their harassment was psychological rather than physical, delivered through social media campaigns, strategic social exclusion, and comments that could always be explained away as jokes or misunderstandings. Their targets were carefully chosen, students who were different in some way that made them vulnerable. The openly gay sophomore whose parents were going through a messy divorce. The scholarship student whose second-hand clothes and free lunch status marked her as different from her affluent classmates. The autistic junior whose social difficulties made him an easy target for public humiliation, disguised as good-natured ribbing. What Amara found most disturbing was how the school had normalized this behavior. Teachers looked the other way, administrators made excuses, and other students either joined in or remained silent out of self-preservation. The boys had created a culture of fear that was invisible to adults, but pervasive among their peers. Her second week brought the first direct encounter. She'd been walking through the main hallway during lunch period, observing the social dynamics and getting a feel for the informal power structures that really governed student life. She noticed Marcus Chun cornering a freshman near the lockers, his body language clearly intimidating while his voice remained low enough that she couldn't hear the specific words. "Is everything all right here?" she'd asked, approaching with calm authority. Marcus had immediately stepped back, his expression shifting to practiced innocence. "Oh, hey, Dr. Williams. Yeah, everything's fine. I was just giving Jason here some advice about his class schedule. Freshman year can be overwhelming, you know." Jason, a small kid with thick glasses and a backpack that looked too heavy for his frame, nodded quickly. "Yeah, he was just helping," he'd mumbled, but his eyes told a different story. "That's wonderful to hear," Amara had replied smoothly. "Jason, if you ever need academic guidance, please remember that my office is always open. We have official mentoring programs that might be more helpful than informal hallway conversations." The message was clear to all three of them. Marcus had smiled tightly and walked away, but not before shooting Jason a look that promised the conversation wasn't over. Amara made a mental note to follow up with the boy and to keep a closer eye on the dynamics she was beginning to understand. That afternoon, she'd received her first real taste of the boy's capabilities. Anonymous social media accounts began posting photos of her from around campus, accompanied by comments that walked the careful line between inappropriate and actionable. Questions about her qualifications, suggestions that she was a diversity hire, and speculation about her personal life that made her skin crawl, but didn't quite cross into territory that would justify disciplinary action. The sophistication of the campaign impressed her even as it disgusted her. These weren't crude teenage taunts but carefully crafted psychological warfare designed to undermine her authority without providing clear evidence of harassment. The accounts were untraceable, the comments just vague enough to avoid direct accusations, and the timing coincidental enough to maintain plausible deniability. But Amara had survived worse than privileged teenagers with too much time and too little supervision. She documented everything, screenshotted the posts before they could be deleted, and began building the kind of systematic case that her years in education had taught her to construct. More importantly, she refused to let the harassment affect her demeanor or her work. Her third week brought an interesting development. She'd been asked to attend the monthly assembly, a tradition at Riverside where students gathered in the main auditorium for announcements, recognition ceremonies, and the occasional motivational speaker. Principal Harrison had mentioned that new faculty members were typically introduced to the student body during these gatherings, a formality that would officially mark her presence in the school community. The auditorium was impressive, with theater-style seating for over 1,200 students and a stage equipped with professional lighting and sound systems. As students filed in that Friday morning, chattering and texting and generally displaying the restless energy of teenagers forced into a mandatory gathering, Amara felt the familiar calm that always preceded important moments. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a charcoal gray pantsuit that projected authority without being intimidating, minimal jewelry, and her hair in a style that was professional but not severe. She wanted to present herself as approachable but not vulnerable, confident but not arrogant. First impressions mattered, especially when dealing with teenagers who could smell weakness from a mile away. As she waited backstage, reviewing the brief remarks she'd prepared about her excitement to join the Riverside family and her commitment to student success, Amara had no idea that Tyler, Jake, and Marcus were already planning their next move. They'd grown frustrated with their inability to rattle her through social media harassment, and were ready to escalate to more direct confrontation. The assembly began with the usual administrative announcements, upcoming events, schedule changes, reminders about dress code and academic integrity policies. Principal Harrison spoke with his characteristic nervous energy, clearly eager to get through the formal business and return to the safety of his office. The students settled into the familiar rhythm of mandatory attention, most scrolling through their phones while maintaining the pretense of listening. "Now," Principal Harrison announced, his voice echoing through the sound system, "I'd like to introduce our new Assistant Principal for Student Affairs, Dr. Amara Williams. Dr. Williams comes to us with extensive experience in educational leadership and a passion for student success. Please join me in welcoming her to the Riverside family." The applause was polite but unenthusiastic, the kind of dutiful response teenagers gave to required displays of respect. Amara walked onto the stage with measured steps, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her expression calm and confident. She approached the podium with the same centered presence she brought to everything else, aware of 1,200 pairs of eyes but unintimidated by their collective gaze. She was about to discover that some of those eyes belonged to young men who had never learned the difference between confidence and cruelty, who mistook privilege for power, and who were about to make the biggest mistake of their high school careers. The microphone hummed softly as Dr. Amara Williams adjusted it to her height, the sound system carrying the small mechanical noise throughout the packed auditorium. 1,200 students stretched before her in neat rows, some genuinely attentive, others lost in their phones, most existing in that peculiar teenage state of forced presence, but mental absence that defined mandatory school assemblies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Good morning, Riverside," she began, her voice clear and warm as it filled the space. "I'm Dr. Williams, and I'm genuinely excited to be joining this community. Over the past few weeks, I've had the privilege of meeting many of you individually, and I've been impressed by your passion for learning, your creativity, and your commitment. TO Excellence. In the third row, Tyler Brennan exchanged a meaningful glance with Jake Morrison. They'd been planning this moment since the previous evening, coordinating through encrypted group chats and private messages that couldn't be traced back to their official school accounts. The plan was simple but effective, a public confrontation that would establish dominance while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid serious consequences. My role here is to support every single one of you in achieving your goals, Amara continued, unaware of the brewing storm. Whether you're struggling with academic challenges, navigating social pressures, or planning for your future beyond these walls, my door is always open. I believe that every student deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued in their educational environment. That last phrase was Tyler's cue. He'd chosen his moment carefully, waiting until she'd established her theme of safety and respect before striking. Standing abruptly in his seat, his voice carried clearly through the auditorium's acoustics as he called out, "That's rich coming from someone who only got hired because of her skin color." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the audience as heads turned toward Tyler, some students looking shocked, others excited by the sudden drama, still others uncomfortable but unsure how to respond. A few teachers scattered throughout the auditorium began moving toward the disruption, but the rows of seated students made quick intervention impossible. Amara's expression didn't change, though every eye in the auditorium was now focused on her reaction. She'd faced worse than this in Chicago, had encountered racism both subtle and overt throughout her career, but she'd learned long ago that responding with anger only gave bullies the reaction they craved. Instead, she drew upon the same centered calm that had carried her through countless sparring matches, the mental discipline that Master Chun had drilled into her through years of training. "Thank you for your comment," she said evenly, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "I'd be happy to discuss my qualifications with you privately after the assembly. My doctoral dissertation, published research, and 15 years of educational experience speak for themselves." But Tyler wasn't finished. Emboldened by the attention and the scattered nervous laughter from some of his peers, he pressed forward. "Yeah, right. We all know how this works. Schools need to fill their diversity quotas, so they hire unqualified candidates and pretend it's about merit." Jake Morrison joined in, his voice carrying from 2 seats over. "My dad says it's reverse. Racism, qualified white candidates getting passed over so schools can look progressive." The auditorium was now completely silent except for the sound of teenagers breathing and the occasional creak of folding seats. Principal Harrison had gone, pale, standing frozen at the side of the stage like a deer in headlights. Several teachers were pushing through the rows of students, but their progress was slow, and Tyler knew he had precious seconds before adult intervention arrived. Marcus Chun, ever the strategist, delivered what they'd planned as the killing blow. Standing and projecting his voice with theatrical precision, he shouted, "Maybe she should go back to whatever ghetto school she came from where lowered standards are normal." The racial slur hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Some students gasped audibly. Others pulled out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a viral moment, and still others looked around nervously, unsure whether to laugh, cheer, or distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. Amara Williams stood at the podium, the microphone amplifying her steady breathing as she processed what had just occurred. At that moment, she had several choices. She could ignore the comments and continue with her remarks, taking the high road but potentially appearing weak. She could respond with anger, justifying it but playing into their hands. She could walk off the stage, maintaining dignity but ceding the battlefield. Instead, she chose a fourth option. "I'd like everyone to remain seated for a moment," she said calmly into the microphone, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the tension like a blade. What just happened here provides an excellent teaching opportunity about respect, consequences, and the difference between courage and cowardice. She stepped away from the podium, moving with fluid grace toward the steps that led down into the auditorium. Her movements were unhurried but purposeful, and something in her body language commanded attention. The whispering and shuffling stopped as 1,200 students watched her descend into their midst. "The three young men who just spoke," she continued, her voice now projecting naturally without amplification, "have demonstrated several important lessons. First, they've shown us what happens when privilege meets ignorance. Second, they've illustrated the difference between having a voice and having something worthwhile to say." Tyler, Jake, and Marcus were now standing in a loose cluster, their bravado beginning to waver as they realized the dynamics had shifted. What they'd planned as a public humiliation of the new administrator was transforming into something else entirely. Other students were creating distance, sensing that association with the trio was becoming toxic. But most importantly, Amara continued, now standing in the aisle just steps away from them, they've provided an opportunity to discuss real courage. You see, real courage isn't about shouting insults from the safety of a crowd. It's not about using your family's wealth and connections to avoid consequences for your actions. Tyler's face was flushing red, his carefully styled hair beginning to show perspiration. "You can't talk to us like that," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence he displayed moments earlier. "My father will—" "Your father do?" Amara interrupted smoothly. "Use his influence to protect you from the consequences of your own choices? That's not strength, Tyler. That's weakness disguised as power." The use of his name hit like a physical blow. She hadn't consulted notes or asked anyone for identification. She simply knew who he was, had done her homework, understood exactly who she was dealing with. The realization that this confrontation wasn't spontaneous from her perspective, that she'd been prepared for something like this, sent a chill through the three boys. Jake Morrison, feeling the need to support his friend, but lacking Tyler's charisma, stepped forward aggressively. "You think you're better than us? You think coming into our school and lecturing us makes you special?" "No, Jake," Amara replied, turning toward him with the same calm attention. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I know the difference between earning respect and demanding it through intimidation. I know the difference between strength and bullying." The word bullying hit the auditorium like a thunderclap. It named what everyone had witnessed, removed the ambiguity that the boys had been counting on, and forced every student present to choose a side. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger. Marcus Chun, recognizing that their carefully planned disruption was spiraling beyond their control, made the mistake that would define the rest of his high school experience. Drawing on his family's academic success and his own advanced placement courses, he attempted to shift the confrontation to intellectual ground where he felt more confident. "This is ridiculous," he announced, his voice carrying the condescension he'd learned from watching his surgeon parents dismiss colleagues they considered inferior. "You're making this into some racial thing when it's really about qualifications and standards. Maybe if you actually earned your position instead of benefiting from affirmative action handouts, you'd understand why people question your presence here." The auditorium held its collective breath. Marcus had crossed lines that even Tyler and Jake hadn't approached, moving from personal insults into territory that was unmistakably racist and legally problematic. Several teachers had finally reached the rows where the confrontation was taking place. But they hesitated, unsure how to intervene in a situation that had moved far beyond normal disciplinary procedures. Amara Williams looked at Marcus Chen for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of martial arts training, years of facing down opponents who had underestimated her, and a lifetime of dealing with people who questioned her right to exist in spaces they considered their own. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you've just made a choice that will follow you for the rest of your life. You've chosen to reveal who you really are in front of 1,200 witnesses. You've chosen to align yourself with hatred instead of growth, with ignorance instead of learning." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "But you've also given me an opportunity to show everyone here what real strength looks like. And for that I thank you." What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times, analyzed by experts in conflict resolution, and discussed in educational leadership conferences for years to come. But in that moment, as Dr. Amara Williams prepared to demonstrate the difference between power and force, between discipline and aggression, she was simply a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for this exact situation. The assembly was about to become a masterclass in consequences, respect, and the kind of strength that couldn't be bought, inherited, or faked. The moment hung suspended in the auditorium air like a held breath. Dr. Amara Williams stood in the aisle, surrounded by 1,200 students whose phones were now openly recording what they sensed would become legendary. Tyler, Jake, and Marcus formed an uncertain triangle around her, their earlier bravado evaporating as they realized they'd pushed far beyond the safe boundaries of their usual harassment campaigns. "You want to see what real qualifications look like?" Amara asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent space. "What 15 years of dedicated training can accomplish? What does discipline and respect actually mean?" Without waiting for an answer, she removed her blazer with deliberate precision, folding it neatly and placing it on an empty seat. Underneath, her white blouse was crisp and professional, but as she moved, the subtle definition of muscle became apparent. This wasn't the soft physicality of someone who spent their days behind desks. This was the controlled power of an athlete who had never stopped training. "Marcus," she said, turning toward the boy who had delivered the most vicious attack, "you mentioned standards. In Taekwondo, we have very specific standards. Would you like a demonstration?" The word Taekwondo rippled through the auditorium like electricity. Students who had been slouching in their seats sat up straighter. Teachers who had been approaching cautiously stopped in their tracks, suddenly uncertain about how to proceed. Principal Harrison, still frozen on the stage, looked like he was calculating the potential lawsuits from every possible outcome. Marcus Chun's face went through several shades of pale as the implications hit him. "You can't touch us," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "There are laws against corporal punishment." "My parents will." "I'm not going to touch you," Amara interrupted smoothly. "I'm going to show you something about respect, control, and the difference between violence and discipline." She stepped back, creating space in the aisle, and assumed a ready position that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had studied martial arts. Her feet were precisely placed, her hands open and relaxed at her sides, her posture balanced and centered. The transformation was subtle but complete. The friendly administrator had become something else entirely. "Tyler," she said, looking directly at the lacrosse player who had started the confrontation, "you're an athlete. You understand training, dedication, sacrifice. Tell me, how many hours per week do you practice your sport?" Tyler, confused by the change in direction, but still trying to maintain his dominance, answered automatically, "About 20 hours. Sometimes more during the season." 20 hours, Amara repeated. "That's impressive dedication. I've been training in Taekwondo for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week for the past 15 years. That's approximately 28,000 hours of practice. Would you like to see what that level of commitment produces?" Before anyone could respond, she moved. It wasn't the explosive violence that the boys had half expected, but something far more impressive, a demonstration of perfect control. She executed a series of forms, traditional Taekwondo patterns that flowed like choreographed poetry. Her kicks rose to head height without apparent effort, her movements precise and powerful yet graceful enough to be mistaken for dance. The auditorium watched in stunned silence as she transitioned from form to form, each movement building on the last. A spinning heel kick that stopped inches from an imaginary opponent's head. A series of hand techniques that cut through the air with audible whooshes. A jumping kick that carried her body horizontal through space before landing with perfect balance. When she finished, there wasn't a sound in the auditorium except for her controlled breathing. She hadn't broken a sweat, hadn't shown any strain, but every person present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't a party trick or a show-off moment. This was a master craftsperson displaying their art. That, she sighed, straightening her blouse and retrieving her blazer, is what real discipline looks like, what actual strength means. And most importantly, what control feels like. Jake Morrison, still reeling from the display but desperate to salvage some dignity, made the fatal mistake of escalating physically. "Big deal," he said, stepping closer with aggressive body language he'd learned from action movies. "Anyone can do some karate moves. Let's see how tough you are when." He reached out as if to grab her arm, the kind of intimidating gesture he'd used successfully on smaller students for years. What happened next occurred so quickly that most observers missed the actual technique, seeing only the result. One moment Jake was reaching toward Dr. Williams with clear aggressive intent. The next he was sitting on the auditorium floor, looking dazed and confused. The technique she'd used was a classic Taekwondo deflection and unbalancing maneuver designed to neutralize an attacker without causing injury. She'd simply redirected his forward momentum while removing his base of support, allowing gravity to do the rest. To untrained eyes, it looked like Jake had somehow tripped over nothing and fallen. "Are you hurt, Jake?" she asked with genuine concern, offering him a hand up. That can happen when you move aggressively without understanding your opponent's capabilities. Jake stared at the offered hand as if it were a snake, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. He'd been standing 1 second and sitting the next, with no clear memory of how the transition had happened. Around him, his classmates were recording everything, and he knew his humiliation would be viral within hours. "I didn't trip," he said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Of course not," Amara agreed pleasantly. "You demonstrated poor judgment and inadequate situational awareness. It's a common mistake among people who confuse aggression with strength." Tyler Brennan, watching his friend's humiliation and recognizing the complete reversal of power dynamics, made a desperate attempt to regain control through the only means he had left: threats and intimidation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying the menace he'd perfected through years of bullying. "You have no idea who you're messing with. My family has connections throughout this district. We'll destroy your career." Amara looked at him with the same calm attention she'd shown throughout the confrontation. "Tyler, let me explain something about real power versus perceived power. Real power comes from competence, integrity, and the respect of others. Perceived power comes from daddy's money and the illusion that wealth can protect you from consequences." She gestured toward the hundreds of recording phones. "Right now, thousands of people are watching you reveal who you really are. Your racist comments, your threats, your attempts at physical intimidation, all captured in high definition and being shared across social media platforms. No amount of family influence can make that disappear." The truth of her words hit Tyler like a physical blow. In their rage and arrogance, they'd created a permanent record of their worst impulses. College recruiters would see this. Future employers would find it. The viral nature of social media meant their behavior would follow them for years, possibly decades. Marcus Chun, always the strategist, tried one last desperate gambit. "You attacked Jake," he said, his voice carrying the authority he'd inherited from his surgeon parents, Everyone saw it. That's an assault on a minor by a school official. You're finished. Amara smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and the expression transformed her face from stern authority to something warmer, but no less formidable. Marcus, I'd encourage you to review the footage carefully. You'll find that Jake initiated physical contact with clear aggressive intent, and I responded with a defensive technique that prevented him from making contact while ensuring he wasn't injured. She paused, letting the legal implications sink in. You'll also find that everything I did was captured on the school's security cameras, which have excellent audio recording capabilities. Your racist comments, your harassment, your coordinated attack, it's all documented evidence. The boys stood in stunned silence as the full scope of their predicament became clear. They'd planned what they thought would be a simple humiliation of a new administrator, counting on their family's influence to protect them from serious consequences. Instead, they'd created a viral moment that would define their reputations for years to come while providing law enforcement and school officials with a detailed record of their behavior. Around them, the auditorium began to stir as students processed what they'd witnessed. The initial shock was giving way to a kind of electric excitement. For years, they'd watched Tyler, Jake, and Marcus terrorize their classmates with impunity. Now, suddenly, dramatically, the power structure had been completely overturned. Now, Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying clearly through the space as she addressed the entire assembly. Let's talk about what real courage looks like, and what happens when bullies finally meet someone who refuses to be intimidated. The demonstration was over, but the lesson was just beginning. The silence that followed Dr. Williams' final statement lasted exactly 7 seconds before chaos erupted. 1,200 students began talking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of excitement, disbelief, and nervous energy that filled the auditorium like a rushing tide. Phones were everywhere now, students frantically texting friends who hadn't witnessed the confrontation, uploading videos to TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat with captions that ranged from shocked emojis to detailed play-by-play narratives. Principal Harrison finally found his voice and his legs, rushing down from the stage with the jerky movements of a man whose careful world had just exploded. Everyone needs to calm down, he announced through the sound system, his voice cracking with stress. Students, please return to your first period classes immediately. This assembly is dismissed, but nobody moved. The magnetic pull of witnessing history in real time kept every student glued to their seats, unwilling to miss whatever might happen next. In the center of it all, Tyler, Jake, and Marcus stood like statues, their faces cycling through expressions of rage, humiliation, and dawning terror as they began to comprehend the magnitude of their situation. Dr. Williams, meanwhile, had returned to her position of calm authority, though she remained in the aisle rather than returning to the stage. She understood crowd psychology better than Harrison did. Attempting to force dispersion would only increase the energy and potentially create a dangerous stampede situation. Instead, she raised her voice with the same commanding presence she displayed throughout the confrontation. Students, she called out, her words cutting through the noise like a conductor calling an orchestra to attention. I understand this has been an unusual morning, but Principal Harrison is right. Please proceed to your first period classes in an orderly fashion. Your teachers are expecting you, and education is why we're all here. The authority in her voice, combined with the respect she just earned through her demonstration, had an immediate effect. Students began gathering their belongings and moving toward the exits, though their conversations remained animated and their glances kept returning to the scene of the confrontation. The viral videos were already spreading beyond the school's walls. By lunch, #Riverside Takedown would be trending nationally. As the auditorium emptied, the adults who remained formed an awkward constellation around the central drama. Several teachers had finally reached the scene, including Ms. Patricia Hayes, the veteran English department chair who had been teaching at Riverside for 30 years. Her expression was a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed satisfaction as she approached the group. "Dr. Williams," she said formally, though her eyes sparkled with something that might have been admiration. "Are you all right? Do you need medical attention or support?" "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," Amara replied smoothly. "Though I think we need to address the immediate situation before it escalates further." Tyler Brennan, still reeling from the complete reversal of his social position, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is assault," he declared, his voice carrying the entitled indignation he'd learned from watching his father bully business competitors. "I'm calling my lawyer right now. This woman attacked a student in front of witnesses." Principal Harrison visibly flinched at the word lawyer, his face going through several shades of pale as he imagined the phone calls he'd be receiving from the district office, the school board, and various angry parents. "Now, Tyler, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can resolve this through proper channels." "Actually," interrupted a new voice from the back of the auditorium, "I'd be very interested in seeing that footage." Everyone turned to see Detective Sarah Martinez of the Fulton County Sheriff's Office walking down the aisle with the measured pace of someone accustomed to crime scenes and hostile witnesses. She was a compact woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. Her presence transformed the atmosphere from school discipline issue to potential criminal investigation. "Detective Martinez," Principal Harrison stammered, "what brings you to Riverside this morning?" "Anonymous tip about a hate crime in progress," she replied matter-of-factly, pulling out a digital recorder. "Caller said 3 students were using racial slurs and threatening a black administrator during a public assembly. Sounded like something that might require official documentation." The blood drained from Marcus Chun's face as he realized the implications. Hate crimes carried serious legal consequences, especially when committed in educational settings. What they'd intended as a simple harassment campaign had potentially crossed into federal criminal territory. "I'd like to speak with each of the involved parties separately," Detective Martinez continued. "Starting with the alleged victims and witnesses, Dr. Williams, would you be available to provide a statement?" "Of course," Amara replied calmly. "I have video evidence from multiple angles, as well as documentation of previous harassment incidents leading up to today's confrontation." Tyler's phone was already buzzing with incoming calls from his father's office, alerted by social media. Notifications and emergency calls from other parents who'd seen the viral videos. Richard Brennan was a man accustomed to solving problems with money and influence. But criminal investigations operated by different rules than school board meetings. Jake Morrison, meanwhile, was experiencing the kind of existential crisis that comes from having your worldview completely shattered in public. For 17 years, he'd lived in a bubble where his family's wealth insulated him from consequences, where his size and aggression had always been enough to intimidate opposition. The casual ease with which Dr. Williams had neutralized his physical threat while maintaining complete control of the situation had revealed the illusory nature of his power. "I want to call my parents," he said quietly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "You'll have that opportunity," Detective Martinez assured him, "right after we review the evidence and determine exactly what charges might be appropriate." The word charges hit the 3 boys like a physical blow. They'd grown up believing their family connections made them untouchable, that their futures at elite colleges and successful careers were guaranteed regardless of their behavior. The possibility of criminal records, of having to explain arrests and convictions to admissions committees and employers, was a reality they'd never seriously considered. Dr. Williams watched their faces cycle through the stages of consequence realization, with the detached interest of someone who'd seen this pattern before. In her Chicago schools, she'd witnessed similar moments when privileged students first encountered accountability. The difference here was scale. At Riverside, the fall from grace was more dramatic because the pedestal had been so much higher. "Detective Martinez," she said professionally, "while we're waiting for the formal interviews, I should mention that this incident appears to be part of a coordinated harassment campaign. I have documentation of social media attacks, cyberbullying activities, and systematic intimidation of multiple students over several weeks." This revelation sent new shockwaves through the remaining group. What had started as damage control for a single incident was expanding into a comprehensive investigation of the boys' entire reign of terror. Teachers who'd witnessed previous incidents but remained silent were now mentally reviewing what they'd seen. Knowing they'd likely be called as witnesses. Ms. Hayes stepped forward with the courage of someone who'd spent 3 decades watching institutional failures and finally saw an opportunity for justice. "Dr. Williams is correct," she said firmly. "I've personally witnessed multiple incidents of harassment, intimidation, and discriminatory behavior from these 3 students. I documented what I could, but felt powerless to address it through normal channels." Her statement opened the floodgates. Other teachers began sharing their own observations, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that had been ignored or minimized by an administration more concerned with maintaining its reputation than protecting its students. The scope of the investigation was expanding exponentially. Principal Harrison looked like a man watching his career implode in real time. The carefully constructed facade of academic excellence that defined Riverside's brand was crumbling, revealing the toxic culture that had festered beneath the surface. Parents would be calling for his resignation. The district office would be demanding explanations. College recruiters would be questioning the school's character recommendations. "I think," Dr. Williams said quietly, addressing the group but speaking primarily to the 3 boys, "this would be an excellent time for everyone to consider the difference between mistakes and choices. Mistakes can be corrected and learned from. Choices reveal character and create consequences." Tyler, Jake, and Marcus stood in the mostly empty auditorium, surrounded by adults whose expressions ranged from disappointment to disgust, facing the ruins of the futures they'd taken for granted. The viral videos were spreading beyond their ability to control or contain. The legal investigation was just beginning. Their reputations were being redefined in real time by millions of strangers, who now knew them only as the racist bullies who'd picked the wrong target. As Detective Martinez began setting up her interview station and Principal Harrison made increasingly frantic phone calls to the district office, Dr. Amara Williams felt a familiar sense of centered calm. This wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. The real work of transformation, accountability, and healing was still ahead. But for the first time since arriving at Riverside High, she felt genuine hope that change was possible. By noon, the parking lot of Riverside High School resembled a war zone. News vans from 3 local television stations had set up camp near the main entrance, their satellite dishes reaching toward an overcast Atlanta sky like technological prayer wheels. Reporters clutched microphones and checked their makeup while camera operators tested angles and lighting. The viral videos had exploded beyond teenage social media into mainstream news coverage, transforming a school discipline issue into a national conversation about racism, privilege, and accountability. Richard Brennan's black Mercedes S-Class cut through the media circus with the aggressive precision of a man accustomed to bulldozing obstacles. At 52, he was the kind of successful businessman who wore his wealth like armor, his tailored suits and expensive watches serving as visible reminders of his power and influence. His dealership empire had made him one of Atlanta's most prominent entrepreneurs, a man whose political donations and country club connections had always smoothed the rough edges of life. But as he parked in the visitor lot and saw reporters turning their cameras toward his approach, Richard Brennan experienced something unfamiliar, the cold touch of consequences beyond his control. His phone had been ringing nonstop since 10 a.m. Calls from business partners wanting to distance themselves from controversy, charity boards questioning his continued involvement, and college recruiters expressing concerns about Tyler's character. References out inside the school, he found chaos barely contained by institutional politeness. Principal Harrison met him in the main office, his usual nervous energy amplified to near-panic levels by the crisis engulfing his carefully managed domain. "Mr. Brennan," Harrison began, his voice carrying the strained courtesy of a man trying to maintain professional relationships while watching his career burn. "I want you to know we're handling this situation with the utmost care and consideration for all parties involved." "Where is my son?" Richard demanded, bypassing pleasantries with the directness of someone used to cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. "And what exactly happened in that auditorium?" Before Harrison could respond, Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway with Detective Martinez. Her presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Even Richard Brennan, despite his anger and protective instincts, found himself reassessing his approach in the face of her calm authority. "Mr. Brennan," she said professionally, "I'm Dr. Williams, and this is Detective Martinez. Your son is currently providing a statement about this morning's incident. You're welcome to consult with legal counsel before he continues." The mention of legal counsel sent ice through Richard's veins. He'd built his success on understanding power dynamics, on knowing when to push and when to negotiate. The presence of law enforcement transformed this from a school discipline matter that money and influence could resolve into something far more serious. Legal counsel for what exactly? He asked, though the viral videos he'd watched on his phone during the drive had already provided most of the answer. Detective Martinez stepped forward with the matter-of-fact professionalism of someone who'd delivered bad news to powerful people before. "Your son, along with 2 classmates, is being investigated for potential hate crime violations, harassment, and assault. The incident was recorded from multiple angles and has been reported to both local and federal authorities." Richard's face went through several color changes as the implications hit him. Hate crimes were federal offenses. They carried serious prison time and permanent consequences that no amount of money could erase. His son's future college recruitment, business opportunities, social standing was evaporating in real time. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, falling back on the aggressive tactics that had served him in business negotiations. "Boys will be boys. A few inappropriate comments don't constitute federal crimes. We're talking about teenagers here." Dr. Williams fixed him with the same steady gaze she'd used on his son. "Mr. Brennan, your son and his friends used racial slurs against a school administrator during a public assembly, then attempted physical intimidation when challenged. This wasn't teenage misbehavior. It was coordinated harassment with clear discriminatory intent. The words hit like physical blows, each one dismantling another layer of denial and rationalization. Richard had spent Tyler's entire life insulating him from consequences, using wealth and connections to smooth over problems before they became serious. But viral videos couldn't be bought off, and federal investigations didn't care about country club memberships. Meanwhile, across town in the affluent Buckhead neighborhood, Dr. Michael and Dr. Sarah Chen were experiencing their own version of parental devastation. Both surgeons at Emory University Hospital, they'd built their lives around precision, excellence, and reputation. Their son Marcus had been destined for medical school, following in their footsteps toward a career that would cement the family status in Atlanta's professional elite. Now they sat in their pristine living room, watching their son's racist rant play on repeat across news channels and social media platforms. The comment section was particularly brutal. Strangers from around the world were dissecting Marcus's character, his upbringing, and his family's values based on 90 seconds of viral footage. "How did we raise a child capable of this?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow with shock and shame. "Where did we go wrong?" Michael, ever the analytical surgeon, was already thinking strategically about damage control. We need the best lawyers money can buy, crisis management consultants, maybe a public apology tour if handled correctly. But Sarah wasn't interested in image rehabilitation. She was confronting the uncomfortable truth that their pursuit of academic excellence and social status had somehow produced a son who felt entitled to dehumanize others based on race. The phone calls from colleagues, the whispered conversations at the hospital, the looks from neighbors, their professional and social networks were already shifting in response to their son's public disgrace. The Morrison family was dealing with their own crisis in their Alpharetta mansion. Jake's father, real estate mogul Thomas Morrison, had built his empire on understanding market psychology and social dynamics. He knew better than most how quickly reputation could affect business relationships and property values. Jake sat in the family's media room, watching himself get effortlessly neutralized by Dr. Williams on every major news network. The footage was particularly damaging because it showed him clearly initiating physical contact before being dropped to the floor in a manner that looked both humiliating and completely controlled. "The lacrosse scholarship is gone," Thomas said bluntly, ending a phone call with Northwestern University's athletic department. They're reevaluating their recruitment priorities in light of character concerns. Jake's mother, Elizabeth, was scrolling through social media comments with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. "They're calling him Floorboy Jake," she reported numbly. "It's already a meme." Someone made a compilation video of him falling set to circus music. The viral nature of their humiliation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their punishment. In previous generations, teenage mistakes might have been contained within school walls or local communities. But the global reach of social media meant their worst moments were being viewed, analyzed, and mocked by millions of strangers across the world. Back at Riverside High, the investigation was expanding beyond the three primary perpetrators. Detective Martinez had discovered a digital trail of coordinated harassment campaigns targeting multiple students over several months. Text message threads revealed detailed planning of psychological warfare against vulnerable classmates. Social media accounts showed systematic efforts to isolate and torment anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. The student body was experiencing its own reckoning. For years, many had watched Tyler, Jake, and Marcus terrorize their classmates while remaining silent out of fear or indifference. Now empowered by Dr. Williams' example and protected by the criminal investigation, witnesses were coming forward with stories that painted a picture of systematic abuse far worse than anyone had realized. Jessica Wu, a sophomore who'd been targeted for her Asian heritage and academic success, finally found the courage to report months of harassment. David Park described being cornered in locker rooms and subjected to homophobic slurs and threats. Maria Santos revealed a campaign of intimidation designed to make her feel unwelcome as one of the few Latina students in advanced placement courses. Each new revelation expanded the scope of the investigation and deepened the community's understanding of how toxic the school culture had become. Parents who'd believed their children attended a pristine suburban institution were confronting evidence of systematic discrimination and bullying that administrators had either ignored or actively covered up. The media coverage was relentless and largely unsympathetic to the three boys and their families. Dr. Williams had become an overnight symbol of strength and dignity in the face of hatred, her calm professionalism contrasting sharply with the ugly behavior of her tormentors. Interview requests were pouring in from national news programs, civil rights organizations, and educational conferences. As the afternoon wore on, the true scope of the consequences began to crystallize. This wasn't just about three boys facing discipline. It was about a community being forced to confront its own failures and hypocrisies. The careful facade of suburban tolerance was cracking revealing deep-seated prejudices and systemic problems that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. The transformation that Dr. Williams had hoped to inspire through education and example was happening, but not in the gradual, measured way she'd envisioned. Instead, it was erupting in a cascade of revelation and accountability that would reshape not just Riverside High School, but the entire community it served. The real reckoning was just beginning. 3 weeks after the assembly incident, the Fulton County Courthouse had become the epicenter of a legal storm that would reshape how educational institutions across the nation handled discrimination and bullying. Federal prosecutors had taken over the case, elevating it from local criminal charges to a comprehensive civil rights investigation that sent shockwaves through Atlanta's educational and legal communities. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Washington stood before Judge Patricia Coleman in federal district court, presenting evidence that painted a damning picture of systematic civil rights violations at Riverside High School. The prosecution's case went far beyond the viral assembly confrontation, revealing a pattern of institutional negligence that had allowed discriminatory harassment to flourish unchecked for years. "Your Honor," Washington began, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "the evidence shows that Riverside High School administrators were not merely negligent in addressing harassment, they were actively complicit in maintaining a hostile environment for students of color, LGBTQ+ students, and other protected classes." The evidence was overwhelming. Digital forensics experts had recovered deleted text messages, social media posts, and email threads that revealed the scope of Tyler, Jake, and Marcus's harassment campaigns. More damaging still were the communications showing that school administrators had received multiple complaints about the boys' behavior, but had consistently failed to take meaningful action. Tyler Brennan sat at the defense table, flanked by 3 expensive attorneys, his confident swagger replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone whose world had collapsed completely. The federal charges were serious: conspiracy to violate civil rights, cyberstalking across state lines, and assault in connection with civil rights violations. Each count carried potential prison time that no amount of family wealth could negotiate away. His father Richard watched from the gallery, his business empire crumbling as corporate partners severed contracts and customers boycotted his dealerships. The Brennan name, once synonymous with success and influence in Atlanta business circles, had become toxic overnight. Country club memberships had been quietly revoked, charity boards had requested resignations, and political allies had distanced themselves with the practiced efficiency of professional survival. Jake Morrison's situation was equally dire. The FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence that his harassment campaigns had targeted students across multiple school districts, thanks to his family's involvement in youth athletics programs throughout the region. What had started as local bullying had evolved into a multi-jurisdictional federal case involving victims in 3 states. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court painted a disturbing picture of a young man who had never developed empathy or understanding of consequences. Years of having his behavior excused and his victims silenced had created what the forensic psychologist termed malignant entitlement, a complete inability to recognize the humanity of anyone he perceived as different or inferior. Marcus Chun faced perhaps the most devastating consequences of all. As the son of prominent physicians, his racist tirade had been particularly shocking to the Korean-American community, which had rallied around his victims while completely rejecting him and his family. The medical board was investigating his parents' hospital privileges, citing concerns about their judgment and character. Marcus himself faced not only federal charges but also a civil lawsuit from the families of students he'd targeted in his cyberbullying campaigns. The institutional changes at Riverside High School were swift and comprehensive. Principal Harrison had been forced to resign within days of the federal investigation launch, replaced by Dr. Keisha Johnson, a veteran administrator known for her expertise in transforming toxic school cultures. The entire administrative staff underwent mandatory civil rights training, and several teachers who had enabled or ignored harassment faced disciplinary action. Dr. Williams found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond Riverside's walls. Her calm, professional response to racist harassment had made her a national symbol of dignity and strength. Universities across the country were inviting her to speak about conflict resolution and civil rights in educational settings. Publishers were offering book deals for her memoir. Civil rights organizations were seeking her expertise in developing anti-bullying curricula, but her focus remained on the students who had suffered in silence for years. The federal investigation had empowered dozens of victims to come forward, creating a comprehensive picture of the toxic culture that had festered at Riverside. Dr. Williams worked closely with counselors and advocacy groups to ensure these students received proper support and protection. The legal proceedings revealed disturbing details about how the harassment had operated. Tyler, Jake, and Marcus had developed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques, using social media algorithms to amplify their attacks and coordinating with students at other schools to expand their campaigns. They had created fake accounts to evade detection, used encrypted messaging apps to plan harassment, and even manipulated online polls and rating systems to humiliate their targets. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a target list found on Marcus's laptop, ranking students by vulnerability and detailing specific psychological pressure points to exploit. The document read like a military intelligence briefing, complete with personal background information, family situations, and strategic recommendations for maximum emotional damage. The prosecution's star witness was Emma Rodriguez, a junior who had been systematically terrorized for over 2 years. Her testimony about the impact of constant harassment on her mental health, academic performance, and family relationships brought several jurors to tears. The defense attorney's attempts to discredit her only highlighted the cruelty of their client's behavior. "They didn't just bully me," Emma testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "They studied me. They learned what would hurt the most, and then they used that knowledge to try to destroy me. It wasn't random teenage meanness, it was calculated psychological torture." The federal sentencing guidelines for civil rights violations were harsh, reflecting society's growing recognition that hate crimes cause damage far beyond their immediate victims. Tyler faced up to 15 years in federal prison, with Jake and Marcus facing similar sentences. Their lawyers had attempted to negotiate plea deals, but the prosecution was unwilling to accept anything less than significant prison time and lifetime restrictions on internet usage. The civil lawsuits were equally devastating. Families of targeted students had filed a class action lawsuit against the school district, seeking damages in the tens of millions. The legal theory was straightforward. The district had created and maintained a hostile educational environment that violated federal civil rights laws. The viral videos provided undeniable evidence of the toxic culture, making the district's liability essentially incontrovertible. More importantly, the case was establishing legal precedents that would protect students nationwide. Federal courts were ruling that schools had an affirmative duty to prevent discriminatory harassment, not merely respond to it after the fact. Administrators who turned a blind eye to systematic abuse could face personal liability, not just institutional consequences. The transformation extended beyond legal proceedings to fundamental changes in how schools approached student safety and civil rights. The Georgia Department of Education mandated new training requirements for all administrators and teachers. The Federal Department of Education issued guidance clarifying schools' obligations under civil rights laws. Universities across the country began incorporating the Riverside case into their education leadership programs as an example of institutional failure and its consequences. Dr. Williams worked with federal officials to develop new protocols for identifying and addressing systematic harassment before it reached crisis levels. Her experience in both urban and suburban schools provided unique insights into how toxic cultures developed across different socio-economic contexts. The techniques she'd learned through martial arts training, situational awareness, de-escalation, strategic response, became central components of the new anti-bullying curricula. As the legal proceedings moved toward conclusion, the broader impact of the case became clear. The viral nature of the original confrontation had sparked a national conversation about privilege, accountability, and the real-world consequences of hatred. Schools across the country were re-evaluating their policies and procedures, recognizing that the age of social media meant that institutional failures could become global scandals overnight. The three boys who had thought themselves untouchable were learning that in the digital age, consequences could be swift, permanent, and inescapable. Their racist harassment hadn't just violated federal law, it had triggered a fundamental shift in how society approached institutional discrimination and student safety. The reckoning they had unleashed would continue long after their sentences were served, transforming educational institutions and legal frameworks across the nation. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate one teacher had become a catalyst for systemic change that would protect countless future students from similar abuse. Justice, it seemed, had found its voice in the most unexpected place, a high school auditorium where one woman's courage had lit a fire that would burn away years of institutional indifference and privileged impunity. 5 years after the assembly that changed everything, the ripple effects of that September morning continued to reshape lives, institutions, and communities across the nation. What had begun as a moment of racist harassment in a suburban Atlanta high school had evolved into a transformative force that touched educational policy, civil rights law, and social consciousness on a scale none of the original participants could have imagined. Tyler Brennan emerged from federal prison after serving 4 years of his sentence, stepping into a world that had moved on without him. At 24, he faced the challenge of rebuilding a life with a federal conviction on his record, no college degree, and a name that remained synonymous with privilege-driven hatred in the digital age. The viral videos of his racist tirade were still easily searchable, ensuring that potential employers, landlords, and romantic partners could access his worst moments with a simple Google search. His father's business empire had not survived the scandal. Brennan Automotive Group, once a cornerstone of Atlanta's business community, had been sold in pieces to pay legal fees and settlement costs. Richard Brennan himself had relocated to a small town in rural Georgia, working as a sales manager at a single dealership owned by strangers. The fall from prominence had been swift and absolute, a cautionary tale about how quickly generational wealth could evaporate when reputation became toxic. But Tyler's story took an unexpected turn in his final year of incarceration. Mandatory counseling and educational programs had begun to crack through the layers of entitlement and prejudice that had defined his adolescence. Working with Dr. Marcus Williams, no relation to Dr. Amara Williams, a prison psychologist specializing in extremist rehabilitation, Tyler began the painful process of understanding the harm he had caused and the privilege that had enabled it. His first public appearance after release was at a conference on hate crime prevention, where he spoke to an audience of educators and law enforcement officials about the psychology of privileged bullying. His testimony was raw and unflinching, describing how wealth and social status had insulated him from consequences while feeding his sense of superiority over others. "I spent 18 years learning that I was special, that rules didn't apply to me, that other people existed for my entertainment," he told the hushed auditorium. "It took federal prison to teach me that every person I hurt was someone's child, someone's friend, someone with dreams and fears just like mine. I can't undo the damage I caused, but I can try to prevent others from making the same choices." Jake Morrison's trajectory had been different, but equally profound. His assault conviction and subsequent civil judgments had bankrupted his family's real estate business, forcing them to relocate to Oregon, where they hoped to start fresh. Jake himself had struggled with severe depression and anxiety following his release, the viral humiliation having destroyed his sense of identity and self-worth. Recovery came through an unexpected source: community service at a youth center in Portland, where he worked with teenagers from backgrounds similar to his own. Many were privileged kids whose behavior was heading toward the same destructive path he had traveled. His personal experience with consequences gave him credibility that traditional counselors often lacked. When you see yourself in these kids, you realize how easily it could have been different, Jake reflected during an interview for a documentary about the case. If one teacher had held me accountable earlier, if one friend had called out my behavior, if I had faced real consequences sooner, maybe those other kids wouldn't have suffered. Marcus Chun's journey proved the most tragic of the three. Upon his release, he found that his parents had divorced. His father had lost his medical license due to the ethics investigation, and his mother had returned to South Korea to escape the shame that had engulfed their American dream. The Korean-American community that had once embraced the Chun family's success had completely rejected Marcus, viewing his racist behavior as a betrayal of their shared experiences with discrimination. Unable to gain admission to any college or find stable employment, Marcus had struggled with substance abuse and had been arrested twice for minor offenses. The promise he had shown as a young strategist had been completely consumed by the consequences of his hatred. His story served as a stark reminder that some choices create damage too profound for complete redemption. Dr. Amara Williams, meanwhile, had leveraged her sudden prominence into a platform for systemic change that exceeded her wildest expectations. The viral moment that had thrust her into the spotlight became the foundation for a career dedicated to transforming educational culture and civil rights advocacy. Her book, Standing Firm: Dignity, Discipline, and the Fight for Educational Justice, became a bestseller and required reading in education programs nationwide. The memoir detailed not just the assembly confrontation, but her broader philosophy of using martial arts principles, discipline, respect, situational awareness to create safe learning environments for all students. More significantly, she had founded the Williams Institute for Educational Equity, a nonprofit organization that worked with schools across the country to identify and eliminate systematic discrimination. The Institute's rapid response teams could deploy to schools facing civil rights crises, providing expertise in conflict de-escalation, community healing, and policy reform. The Institute's crowning achievement was the development of the Riverside Protocol, a comprehensive framework for preventing and addressing discriminatory harassment in educational settings. The protocol combined early warning systems that could identify problematic behavior patterns, intervention strategies that emphasized accountability and education over punishment, and follow-up support that helped both victims and perpetrators process their experiences constructively. Riverside High School itself had become an unlikely model for successful institutional transformation. Under Dr. Keisha Johnson's leadership, the school had implemented revolutionary approaches to student culture that eliminated the social hierarchies and toxic dynamics that had enabled systematic harassment. The changes went far beyond policy. Updates to fundamental shifts in how students, teachers, and administrators related to each other. The school's Dignity Initiative required all students to participate in conflict resolution training, cultural competency education, and peer mentorship programs. Rather than simply punishing problematic behavior, the school focused on creating positive social dynamics that made harassment socially unacceptable and provided multiple intervention points before situations escalated to crisis levels. The academic results were remarkable. Test scores improved as students felt safer and more supported. College acceptance rates reached new highs as students developed stronger relationships with teachers and counselors. Most importantly, anonymous surveys showed dramatic decreases in reported harassment, discrimination, and bullying incidents. Emma Rodriguez, who had been one of the most severely targeted victims of Tyler Jake and Marcus's harassment campaigns, had emerged as a powerful voice for student rights and mental health advocacy. Now a senior at Georgetown University studying international relations and psychology, she credited the support she received after coming forward with saving both her academic career and her mental health. The hardest part wasn't the harassment itself, she explained during a speech at the National Student Safety Conference. It was feeling like no one cared, like the adults who were supposed to protect us were more interested in protecting the school's reputation than protecting students. Dr. Williams changed that, not just for me, but for thousands of students who came after us. Emma's advocacy work focused on the intersection of technology and harassment, helping schools and lawmakers understand how social media platforms could amplify discrimination and create new forms of psychological abuse. Her testimony before Congress had influenced federal legislation, requiring social media companies to implement stronger protections for minors facing cyberbullying. The legal precedents established by the Riverside case continued to shape civil rights law and educational policy. The Supreme Court had cited the case in 3 separate decisions related to institutional liability for discrimination, establishing that schools could face federal intervention for systematic failures to protect students' civil rights. The financial settlements had totaled over $50 million, creating a fund that provided counseling services for harassment victims nationwide and supported research into prevention strategies. The magnitude of the financial consequences had sent a clear message to educational institutions. Ignoring discrimination was not just morally wrong, but economically catastrophic. Perhaps most significantly, the case had changed public perception about the relationship between privilege and accountability. The viral nature of the original confrontation had sparked a national conversation about how wealth and social status could insulate young people from consequences, potentially creating entitled adults who viewed others as less than human. Documentary Lessons from Riverside, which premiered 5 years after the incident, won an Emmy Award for its exploration of how institutional change could emerge from moments of crisis. The film followed the ongoing stories of all the major participants, showing how a single moment of courage could catalyze transformation that extended far beyond its original context. Dr. Williams, now 44 and recognized as one of the nation's leading experts on educational equity, often reflected on how her martial arts training had prepared her for that September morning. The principal's Master Chun had taught her discipline, respect, strategic thinking, and the wisdom to know when action was necessary had guided her through the confrontation and everything that followed. True strength, she would tell audiences during her speaking engagements, isn't about dominating others or avoiding consequences. It's about standing firm in your principles even when it's difficult, protecting those who can't protect themselves, and believing that change is possible, even in the most toxic environments. As she looked back on the assembly that had changed everything, Dr. Williams saw not just a moment of personal vindication, but a lesson about the power of individual courage to inspire collective transformation. 3 young men had thought they could continue their reign of terror with impunity, counting on institutional indifference and their families' influence to protect them from accountability. Instead, they had encountered someone who refused to be intimidated, who understood that real strength came from discipline and dignity rather than aggression and privilege. That refusal to back down had created a cascade of change that protected countless students from experiencing the harassment that had once defined Riverside High School's culture. The international impact of the Riverside case had been equally profound. Educational systems in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia had adopted modified versions of the Riverside Protocol, recognizing that discriminatory harassment transcended national boundaries. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, had invited Dr. Williams to serve on a global task force addressing school-based discrimination, elevating the lessons learned from a suburban Atlanta assembly to international policy discussions. In Japan, where bullying had reached crisis levels in many schools, Dr. Williams' integration of martial arts philosophy with educational leadership had particularly resonated. Master Chun's original teachings about discipline and respect had come full circle, inspiring a new generation of educators to view conflict resolution as a martial art, requiring both mental and emotional mastery. The technological innovations that emerged from the case had revolutionized how schools monitored and prevented harassment. The artificial intelligence systems developed by the Williams Institute could analyze communication patterns across school networks, identifying potential harassment campaigns before they escalated to crisis levels. These early warning systems had prevented dozens of situations similar to Riverside from reaching the point of viral confrontation. Social media platforms had been forced to reckon with their role in amplifying harassment after the Riverside case demonstrated how their algorithms could weaponize teenage cruelty. New reporting mechanisms, AI-powered content moderation, and mandatory digital citizenship education had emerged from the legal and public pressure generated by the case. Tyler's transformation had become a case study in redemption psychology, studied by researchers trying to understand how privilege-induced entitlement could be overcome through genuine accountability and education. His speaking engagements at private schools institutions similar to Riverside had proved particularly effective because wealthy students couldn't dismiss his experience as irrelevant to their circumstances. His relationship with his father had slowly rebuilt over years of difficult conversations and shared community service work. Richard Brennan had eventually joined his son's prevention advocacy, using his business experience to help other wealthy families understand how privilege could become a destructive force when not tempered by accountability and empathy. "I gave my son everything except consequences," Richard would tell parent groups at elite schools. "I thought love meant protecting him from difficulty, but what I actually did was prevent him from developing character. The hardest lesson I learned was that real love sometimes requires allowing your children to face the results of their choices." Jake's work in Portland had evolved into a national program called Second Chances, which connected young people who had committed hate crimes with communities they had harmed. The program's success rate in preventing recidivism was remarkable. Over 90% of participants remained crime-free 5 years after completion, compared to less than 60% for traditional criminal justice approaches. The program's methodology drew heavily from restorative justice principles, but with innovations that addressed the specific psychology of privilege-driven hatred. Participants were required to live for extended periods in communities they had previously targeted, working in service roles that forced them to see their former victims as complete human beings rather than objects of contempt. Jake's own participation in the program had included 6 months working at a community center in East Atlanta, serving primarily Black and Hispanic families. The experience had been transformative, breaking down the racial stereotypes and class prejudices that had fueled his harassment campaigns at Riverside. When you actually know people, when you see their struggles and hopes and dreams, it becomes impossible to dehumanize them, Jake explained during a training session for new program participants. Hatred requires distance. Empathy requires proximity. Marcus's story had become a cautionary tale about the limits of institutional intervention. When personal transformation was rejected, despite multiple opportunities for rehabilitation and community support, he had continued to blame others for his circumstances rather than accepting responsibility for his choices. His final arrest, for assault against a Black convenience store clerk, had been captured on security cameras that showed him using the same racist language that had originally gone viral at Riverside. The footage served as a stark reminder that education and opportunity, while necessary, were insufficient without genuine personal commitment to change. The contrast between Marcus's trajectory and those of his former accomplices had become central to understanding why some people could overcome patterns of hatred while others remained trapped by them. Researchers studying the case identified several key factors: family support, community accountability, and most importantly, the willingness to accept responsibility rather than deflect blame. Dr. Williams' influence had extended far beyond educational settings into corporate diversity training, law enforcement reform, and even international diplomacy. Her techniques for maintaining dignity under attack while demonstrating strength without aggression had been adapted for use in hostile business negotiations, police de-escalation training, and conflict resolution between nations. The Williams method, as it had become known, emphasized the power of prepared calm in the face of aggression. Like her martial arts training, it required extensive practice and mental conditioning, but practitioners reported remarkable success in transforming potentially violent confrontations into opportunities for education and growth. Her TED Talk, The Martial Art of Moral Courage, had been viewed over 50 million times and translated into 37 languages. The presentation demonstrated how the principles that govern physical self-defense could be applied to defending one's values, dignity, and community against attacks that were psychological rather than physical. The talk's most powerful moment came when she recreated the assembly confrontation, showing how her response had been guided by martial arts principles, assessing the threat, controlling her emotional response, using minimum necessary force, and maintaining situational awareness throughout the encounter. In Taekwondo, we learn that the most skilled fighter is the one who ends a conflict without throwing a punch, she explained to the captivated audience. In life, the most powerful person is the one who transforms hatred into an opportunity for growth, both for themselves and for their attackers. Riverside High School had become a pilgrimage site for educators worldwide, with delegations visiting monthly to study the transformation that had occurred since the assembly incident. The school's approach to preventing harassment had been documented in dozens of academic papers and had influenced educational policy in all 50 states. The most innovative aspect of Riverside's new culture was its Circle of Accountability program, where students who engaged in problematic behavior faced panels of their peers rather than traditional adult-imposed punishments. These circles, modeled on indigenous justice practices but adapted for modern educational settings, had proved remarkably effective at changing behavior while maintaining community cohesion. Students who participated in accountability circles reported higher levels of empathy, stronger relationships with their peers, and greater understanding of how their actions affected others. The program had been so successful that it was being piloted in juvenile justice systems across the Southeast. Emma Rodriguez's advocacy work had evolved into a scholarship foundation that supported students who had survived harassment campaigns. The Rodriguez Foundation provided not just financial assistance, but comprehensive support, including counseling, mentorship, and advocacy training that helped survivors transform their experiences into tools for protecting others. Her memoir, Finding Voice: From Victim to Advocate, had become required reading in social work programs and had inspired similar foundations supporting harassment survivors in communities across the nation. The book's unflinching examination of how institutional indifference had enabled her tormentors had led to policy changes in dozens of school districts. The Foundation's most innovative program connected harassment survivors with current victims, creating support networks that transcended geographical boundaries. Through secure online platforms and local meets, young people facing discrimination could access support from others who had survived similar experiences and emerged stronger. Surviving harassment isn't enough. Emma would tell new participants. In the program, the real victory comes when you use your experience to make sure others don't have to suffer the way you did. That's when you stop being a victim and become a protector. The legal framework established by the Riverside case had continued to evolve, with federal courts expanding the definition of institutional liability for discriminatory harassment. The Riverside Standard now required schools to demonstrate proactive prevention efforts rather than simply responding to incidents after they occurred. This shift from reactive to preventive approaches had fundamentally changed how educational institutions approached student safety. Schools were now required to conduct regular climate assessments, provide mandatory bias training for all staff, and maintain detailed documentation of intervention efforts. The financial impact of these requirements had been substantial, but the human cost of inaction had proved far greater. Schools that implemented comprehensive prevention programs saw dramatic reductions in harassment incidents, improved academic outcomes, and enhanced community relationships that more than offset the initial investment. 10 years after the assembly, the ripple effects continued to expand in unexpected directions. A new generation of educators, inspired by Dr. Williams' example, was entering the profession with fundamentally different approaches to student discipline and community building. These young teachers, many of whom had studied the Riverside case in their education programs, brought fresh perspectives on how schools could become true sanctuaries for learning and growth. The legacy of that September morning continued to ripple outward, ensuring that the question, "What would Dr. Williams do?" became a touchstone for educators, administrators, and students facing their own moments of moral choice. In schools across the nation, her example served as proof that one person's courage to stand firm could indeed change the world. But perhaps the most profound impact was one that couldn't be measured in policies or programs. The countless young people who had learned that dignity was non-negotiable, that hatred could be transformed through education and accountability, and that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in protecting the vulnerable and standing firm in one's principles. In assembly halls and classrooms across the globe, a new generation was learning these lessons, ensuring that the courage displayed on that September morning in suburban Atlanta would continue to inspire and protect students for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.